My parents raised my rent so my spoiled sister could live there for free while I paid for everything. My parents like to say that it makes sense for an unmarried daughter to live at home until she has her life completely figured out, and for a long time I pretended that sounded reasonable instead of suffocating. I am 22. I study software development at a community college. I work part-time testing code for a small local company, and on paper everything looks fine. Every month I send my parents a transfer with my share of the bills. I cook dinner a couple of nights a week. I keep my room clean. I go to class. I go to work. I come home. If you drove past our house, you would probably think, nice, normal family. Kids all grown up, but still close. Inside, it feels more like I am a tenant in a building where the landlords never stop watching and keep reminding me that technically they can evict me whenever they want. The only reason I agreed to stay was money. Rent where I live is ridiculous, and commuting from my parents' place to campus and work is cheap and easy. My dream is to start a tiny tech company one day, something small and nerdy and mine, and every month I watch my savings account like it is a little plant on a windowsill. I tell myself that every time I put up with a passive-aggressive comment from my mother or a lecture from my father, that number in my account is what I am really doing it for. I thought I could keep my head down, graduate, keep working, and then leave on my own timeline. That plan exploded the day my older sister showed up on the front porch with her husband and their 2 kids and 3 enormous suitcases like she was starring in some low-budget reality show. I came home from class, walked into the kitchen, and found my mother clapping her hands like she had just won the lottery while my sister told a story about some amazing business opportunity. The kids were running in circles with their shoes on. My father was nodding along like a commentator, and nobody had bothered to tell me that our already cramped house had just become a boarding house. My sister is only a year older than me, but we have never felt like we were from the same planet. When we were teenagers, she was the one sneaking out, skipping school, dating people my parents hated, and somehow she always got a soft, "We are just worried about you" talk, and then everything went back to normal. If I even came home 10 minutes late, my parents would be sitting on the couch with the lights on, asking for explanations like I had committed a crime. She failed classes, they blamed the teachers. I got an A-, they asked what happened to the plus. She got pregnant right after high school and married the boyfriend in a rush job wedding that my parents paid for, even though my father said he was not sure it was a good idea. They helped them get a small place, helped with furniture, helped with diapers, always with this proud tone like, "Look how generous we are, look how we support our children." Meanwhile, I was working evenings at a grocery store and trying not to fall asleep in class. About a year before the whole situation I am about to tell you, my sister announced that she and her husband were starting a business. Construction work, according to her, renovation projects, some big contract that was going to pay out so much money they would be able to buy a house in a better neighborhood and take care of everyone. My parents ate it up. They shoved money at them. They bragged to every relative about their daughter, the entrepreneur. They told me I should be more like her, less obsessed with screens. So when she walked back into the house that day, dragging those suitcases, she already had the script ready. The business was doing amazingly, obviously. And they had just landed a huge job, obviously. But they needed a place to stay for a little while paperwork went through and some payment cleared. My sister smiled and said it would be just a few months. And my parents were already nodding before she finished her sentence. Nobody asked basic questions like, if the business is doing so great, why do you need to move back into your parents' house with 2 kids and all your stuff? I asked that later, privately, and you can imagine how well that went. At first, I tried to be a decent person about it. I told myself it is temporary, kids are loud, families help each other, all that. The problem is my parents' idea of helping is always one way. My sister and her husband did not pay rent. They did not help with utilities. They did not even do the grocery shopping. They just slid into the house like they were the main residents and the rest of us were extras in their show. The kids took over the living room with toys, sticky cups, and cartoons blasting at full volume all the time. I had an important project due for one of my classes around then, something that counted for a huge part of the grade, and I remember sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop while one kid screamed because the other one took a toy. My sister yelled from the hallway about how no one ever helped her, and my mother kept trying to talk to me about what we should cook for some family dinner. I put on headphones, but you cannot noise cancel people walking through your workspace every 2 minutes, bumping your chair, asking if you can watch the kids for just a second. I missed the deadline by a few hours because I had to redo something I messed up after being interrupted 5 times in the same paragraph. My professor was not happy. Around the same time, I started showing up late to my part-time job because the mornings were chaos. Sharing one bathroom with 4 more people, trying not to trip over toys on the stairs, waiting for someone to move their car in the driveway so I could get mine out. It all added up. My supervisor pulled me aside and did the whole, "We like you, but we have schedules to keep" speech. I went home that day wanting to cry and also smash my phone. Instead of asking if I was okay, my parents called a family meeting. We were all in the living room, the kids bouncing on the couch while my father cleared his throat like a judge. My mother had that look she gets when she thinks she is about to deliver an important life lesson. My father started talking about how the cost of living had gone up, how there were more mouths to feed now, how the utility bills were higher. I knew exactly where it was going before he said it. They wanted me to pay more. I already contributed a fixed amount every month. It hurt, but I did it because I knew living anywhere else would be more expensive. When I tried to say that my budget was tight and my hours at work were limited, my father cut me off. He said, in that calm voice he uses when he is actually furious, that my contribution was no longer enough and that I needed to step up like an adult. My sister sat there with her eyes on her phone, pretending not to listen, even though every time my parents mentioned money, she tilted her head slightly like a cat hearing a can open. I asked very carefully whether my sister and her husband were going to start contributing too. My mother's face hardened in a second. She said, "Your sister is in a delicate moment. She is building something big for this family. She needs support, not pressure." I said I understood that, but we all lived in the same house, and the kids ate food and used water and electricity just like everyone else. My father sighed dramatically and said he was tired of my attitude, that I always made everything about fairness and rules, and that sometimes family did not work like a spreadsheet. The next morning, there was a child's bed in my room. I wish I were exaggerating. I drove home from work, opened my door, and there it was, a little bed pushed against my wall, covered in cartoon sheets, with stuffed animals lined up on the pillow. My sister had decided that one of the kids should sleep in my room because it is quieter. Nobody asked me. Nobody even texted me. My few square feet of privacy had just been turned into a shared space because it made their life easier. When I confronted my sister, she shrugged and said there was nowhere else to put the bed, that the kids needed sleep, that I was being dramatic. My mother jumped in to say that I spend most of my time at school or work anyway, so what did it matter? I said it mattered because it was my room, the only place in the house that felt like mine. And I got the classic, "This is our house, we decide." You know that feeling when you are angry enough that your hands shake, but you also know that if you yell, you will be the one labeled out of control? That. After that, it started to feel like every boundary I had left was optional. One afternoon, I came in and found my sister's husband standing by my desk, drawer open, flipping through papers. He jumped back when he saw me and smiled like he was just caught doing something cute. He said he was looking for a pen. My pens are on top of the desk, in a visible cup, so that made 0 sense. I walked over and saw that the folder where I keep my bank statements and some documents was sitting slightly out of place, and one page that I knew had been on top was gone. Later, I realized it was my most recent bank statement, the one with my full balance printed in bold at the top. That is how my sister ended up knowing the exact number sitting in my account. He left the room quickly, still talking, still smiling, acting like it was nothing. That night, I bought a small lock for my main drawer and moved my important documents into my backpack. I slept badly, replaying the way he jumped when I opened the door. A couple of nights later, I was in my room trying to cram for an exam, the kids' bed empty for once because both children had passed out in my parents' room after a day of complete sugar chaos. The walls in our house are thin, so you hear everything whether you want to or not. I heard my sister in the living room talking low, and then my mother's voice, and then my father's. I was not trying to listen, but when you hear your name, you stop pretending that you are not. They were talking about my savings. My sister was telling my parents the exact amount that I had saved, down to the last few dollars, and I felt my stomach drop because there was only one way she could know that. My father sounded impressed, my mother sounded excited, and my sister kept saying things like, "She does not even use that money, it is just sitting there." And imagine what I could do with that investment. They were already calling it an investment and saying things like, "Family should help family." I sat on my bed, laptop open in front of me, and I felt like the floor tilted a little. It was this mix of anger and humiliation and this weird sense of being hunted. My parents had always controlled my schedule, my friends, my curfews. I never imagined they would go after my savings too. The next day, my sister cornered me in the kitchen while my coffee was still brewing and my brain was not awake enough for a fight. She started gently, thanking me for being so responsible, and saying that not everyone our age thought ahead like I did. I knew it was flattery and I still kind of soaked it in, because that is how starved I was for any positive words from my family. Then she slid into the real reason she was there. She wanted me to put my savings into the business. According to her, They had this big contract lined up. All they needed was a little cash to hold them over until the client paid the first installment. She said I would get my money back in a few months, plus extra, and that we could maybe even buy a bigger place where we could all live more comfortably. She kept using the word we like we were a team. Her husband showed up halfway through with spreadsheets on his tablet that he claimed proved how safe and profitable it would be. I said no. Not soft, not let me think about it. I said it clearly. That money was for my future, for my business, for getting out. I had worked crappy jobs and skipped going out with friends and bought the cheapest food I could find to grow that number. I told her I was not comfortable mixing family and money like that, especially when I had never seen an actual contract or invoice from this so-called big project. Her whole face changed. The sweetness dropped off like someone flipped a switch. She called me selfish. She said I thought I was better than everyone because I studied technology and had a little job with computers. She said I was letting my niece and nephew suffer in a crowded house while I hoarded money in a bank account for some ridiculous fantasy. Over the next few days, my parents joined in, like they had gotten a memo. My mother cried at the dinner table about how she never imagined raising a daughter who would turn her back on her own sister. My father gave speeches about how in a real family, no one says mine, only ours. They talked about how they had paid for my education so far and how without them I would not be where I was. They did not mention that I had also been paying my way for years. Every time I tried to explain that this was not about love, it was about trust and history and math, they acted like I was stabbing them in the back. In their version of the story, I was the cold, calculating one, and my sister was just a dreamer trying to give her kids a better life. The breaking point came during dinner one night when my sister's phone rang, and my mother grabbed it off the table, already saying hello before even checking who it was. Her smile evaporated in 2 seconds. She walked into the hallway with the phone pressed to her ear. And the only reason I know this is because she did not close the door, and my sister turned the volume down on the television so low that we could all hear fragments. It was my sister's in-laws. They were yelling. Even from across the room, through the thin walls, you could hear the anger. My mother tried to calm them down, but her voice started to rise too. My father stood up and paced by the window. My sister stared at the floor like a teenager caught cheating on a test. The kids kept eating macaroni, oblivious. When the call finally ended, my mother came back into the room looking like someone had punched her in the stomach. My father sat down heavily. There was a long silence, and then he said, in this drained voice I had never heard from him, that the wonderful big contract my sister had been talking about for months had never actually existed. The company she and her husband had invested in had folded ages ago. The money my parents and her in-laws had given them was gone. They had been living with her in-laws for months, lying about deadlines and excuses while draining them dry, until the in-laws finally kicked them out. So the whole time my sister had been talking about waiting for some huge payment, she had already lost everything. For a second, I thought, that is it. They are finally going to see it. They are going to connect the dots. They are going to realize that giving my sister more money is like pouring water into a bucket with no bottom. I waited for someone to say it. Instead, my father turned to me. He said that this was why family had to stick together. That things had gone wrong, yes, but my sister had 2 small children and no home of her own, and that we could not just sit there and let them drown. He said I was the only one in the family with real savings, and that sometimes life threw curveballs, and you had to sacrifice for the people you loved. My mother nodded and added that maybe this was why God had allowed me to save that much in the first place, so that I could help now. It felt like I was listening to people speaking another language. They had just found out that my sister had lied to them for months, lost tens of thousands of dollars, used both sets of parents as walking wallets, and the conclusion they reached was that I needed to hand over my savings. Later that night, my father knocked on my door and sat on the chair by my desk like he used to when I was a kid, and he wanted to have a talk. He told me they had decided, as the heads of the household, that I would need to use my savings to help my sister get back on her feet. He tried to sound reasonable. He said I was young, that I would have more time to save again, that my plans could wait a few years. He said my sister did not have that luxury because she had children. He did not phrase it as a question. I told him I loved my niece and nephew, but I was not willing to throw away years of work into a business that had already proven it could not be trusted. I reminded him that my sister and her husband had lied about their situation, had stolen time and money from everyone, and that giving them more would not fix that pattern. I thought I was being calm. Halfway through, his face went flat. He told me that if I could not be part of this family, maybe I needed to find somewhere else to live. He did not yell. That almost made it worse. He just said it, like he was offering me a cup of water. My mother came in at some point and added that if I was going to act like a stranger in their house, then maybe it was time to be one. They gave me a week to think about it. Either I helped or I started looking for another place. I did not sleep much after that. I spent that night staring at the ceiling, counting all the times I had swallowed comments, all the times I had picked up my sister's slack, all the times I had heard my parents brag about her and barely acknowledge me. I opened my banking app and stared at the number that represented every double shift, every skipped outing, every cheap meal. My chest hurt. I kept thinking, if I give this to them, I will never get out. A couple of days later, after I had dragged myself through class and work on caffeine and anger, a girl from one of my courses overheard me on the phone with a friend, ranting in the campus parking lot. When I hung up, she asked if I was okay. I gave her the watered-down version, just enough to explain that I might need a place to stay soon. She blinked and said, "Wait, you are looking to move out? My roommate just told me she is transferring at the end of the month. I am going to need someone to split rent." That was the first moment in weeks that felt like oxygen. Her place was small, in a not-so-great building a bus ride away from campus. But it was within my budget if I tightened everything. We went to see it together on a Saturday. The living room was tiny, the kitchen was old, and there was a weird stain on the hallway carpet that the landlord blamed on a previous tenant's art project. But the bedrooms had doors that locked. There was no one yelling in the background, no children's beds shoved into other people's spaces, no parents who thought my bank account belonged to them. By the time we left, my brain had already started calculating. I could pay my share of the rent and bills, buy groceries, and still tuck away a small amount every month if I picked up a few extra hours. It would not be as much as before, but it would be mine, and my sanity was worth more than interest. I did not tell my parents anything. Instead, I started moving out in pieces. After work, I would put a couple of boxes in the trunk of my car, drive to the new place, and unload them. I took my clothes first, then my books, then my personal stuff from the bathroom. I left the furniture my parents had bought because I did not want to give them any reason to claim I had stolen anything. I bought a cheap mattress online and had it delivered straight to the new apartment. The day I signed the lease, my hands were shaking so much I almost dropped the pen. The landlord made small talk while I filled out the forms, asking about school and work, completely unaware that signing my name felt like the loudest act of rebellion I had ever pulled off in my life. When I handed everything back, he said, "Welcome home," in this casual way, and I had to bite the inside of my cheek so I would not start crying in front of him. The landlord did not care about my backstory. He just cared that I had a job and enough money for the deposit and first month. It was weirdly comforting. On the last day, when most of my things were gone, I walked into my old room and looked around. The child's bed was still there. My desk was almost empty. Just a lamp and a notebook I did not want anymore. I took one last look at the posters on the wall, the marks on the dresser from when I had accidentally knocked over nail polish as a teenager. I felt sad for a second, not for the room itself, but for the version of me who had tried so hard to be the good daughter here. Then I left my key on the dresser and walked out. A little over a week passed before my mother realized something was off. I guess she was so busy dealing with my sister and the kids that my absence blended into the background. She texted me a couple of times about groceries and schedules like nothing had changed, and I answered in short, neutral messages because I was a coward who was not ready for the fight yet. Finally, she called one afternoon while I was at the new apartment, sitting on the floor eating cheap frozen pizza with my new roommate. The number flashed on my screen, and my stomach did that familiar flip. I stepped into my tiny bedroom to answer. She did not say hello. She started with, "You have not been home in days." I said as calmly as I could that I did not live there anymore. There was a silence so heavy I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Then she laughed, this little disbelieving sound, and asked what I was talking about. I told her I had moved out, that I had signed a lease with someone from school, that I had already taken my things. I said it simply, like I was reciting a fact from a quiz. She lost it. She started yelling about how ungrateful I was, how they had given me everything, how I had sneaked around like a thief. She said they had counted on my money to get through this difficult time, that I had abandoned them in their hour of need. She never mentioned giving me a choice between handing over my savings or leaving. In her version, they had just lovingly invited me to help, and I had run away. I reminded her, maybe louder than I should have, that I had always paid my share, that my sister had been living there rent-free, that my savings were not some community fund to fix every disaster my sister created. She started crying, saying I was breaking her heart. My father got on the phone at some point and told me I had embarrassed them in front of the relatives, that everyone knew now that their youngest daughter had turned her back on family for money. I felt my throat closing up. My hands were shaking again. At some point, my mother said something like, "You will regret this when we are gone." And that was the moment something in me snapped. I said that I loved them, but I was done being the emergency fund and emotional punching bag for everyone in that house. Then I hung up. I blocked her number. My roommate had been there when I hung up. She did not say anything at first, just handed me a glass of water and sat down on the floor next to me like we were at some weird sleepover. Later that night, she asked if I was okay. Really okay. And I gave her the shortened version of the whole disaster. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said, "Your family trained you to feel guilty just for existing with a spine." It made me laugh and cry at the same time, which honestly summed up that entire week. For the next few days, my phone turned into a small war zone. Calls from unknown numbers, messages from relatives I barely knew, even a voicemail from my father's work line. Everyone had a version of the same speech. Family is everything. How could you do this to your parents? Your sister is struggling, your poor niece and nephew. No one asked if I was okay. No one asked what it had been like living in that chaos. One of my uncles showed up at my job during my lunch break. Like this was some kind of intervention. He sat across from me in the break room and said he was there as a neutral mediator, that surely we could work something out. Maybe I could at least give them part of my savings. I told him I did not want to discuss my finances with him. He looked offended, said he was only trying to help, and that I was letting pride ruin my relationships. I went back to my desk that day feeling like the villain in a story I did not even remember agreeing to be in. Nights were the worst. I would lie in my new bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the building, wondering if I had overreacted. I replayed every conversation with my parents, every time my sister had twisted a situation, every time I had been expected to clean up a mess I did not make. I cried. A lot, which I am not proud of, but I am also not going to pretend I walked away from my family without bleeding. About 3 weeks after the big bombing of my phone, there was a knock on my apartment door close to midnight. My roommate was away visiting her parents for the weekend, so it was just me. I froze for a second, because apparently I live in a world now where late-night knocks make me nervous. I checked the peephole and felt my stomach sink. It was my parents. They were standing in the hallway, both of them soaked from the rain, my mother clutching her purse like it might float away, my father with his hair plastered to his forehead. They looked smaller than I remembered, which made me feel this tiny stab of guilt even before anyone opened their mouth. I cracked the door and asked what they were doing there. My mother said they needed a place to stay for a little while. My father said it was just temporary, that they were in a complicated situation, and they thought maybe we could help each other. The wording made me want to laugh and scream at the same time. I pointed out that I lived in a tiny 2-bedroom apartment with another person, that there was literally nowhere for them to sleep except maybe on the floor. My mother said they could take my roommate's bed until she comes back, like it was some kind of hotel. I asked the question that had been hanging over the whole scene. Why were they not at their own house? There was a long pause. And then my father sighed and told me that after our fight, things had gotten tense at home. My mother had discovered that some cash she kept hidden for emergencies was missing. She confronted my sister's husband about it, and he admitted that he had taken it to cover some business expenses. My mother went nuclear. My sister took her husband's side. There was a huge fight, insults, threats. According to my parents, my sister screamed that they had no right to judge her after everything they had made her go through, which is wild considering they had basically sponsored her entire adult life. Anyway, at some point, my sister told them that if they did not like how things were, they could leave. My parents thought she would calm down, that it was just a tantrum. They packed a couple of bags and went to stay with a cousin in another town for a few days, expecting that by the time they came back, everyone would be ready to talk. When they returned, the locks had been changed. My father said they stood on the porch in the rain, knocking and ringing the bell while the lights were on inside. Eventually, my sister's husband appeared at an upstairs window and told them that the house belonged to them now, because they were the ones actually living there, paying the utilities, taking care of the kids. He said my parents had made it clear that my sister was on her own. So fine, she was on her own. My sister yelled from somewhere inside that they could call whoever they wanted, but she was done being treated like a burden. My parents thought about calling the police, but they were humiliated and tired and, in my father's words, did not want the neighbors to see a scene. So instead of standing up for themselves at their own front door, they walked away and eventually ended up at mine. They wanted me to let them in without questions. They wanted to roll their suitcases over my boundary like they had rolled my sister's kids into my old bedroom. For a second, I imagined it, the way my new quiet life would disappear under the weight of all their drama, the late-night guilt speeches, the subtle comments about how much nicer their situation would be, if I had just helped when they first asked. The way I would end up paying for extra groceries and utilities while they got back on their feet. I told them no. Not immediately, not coldly. I opened the door wider so they were not standing in the hallway. I offered them towels. I made them tea in the tiny kitchen. We sat at the little table my roommate had found secondhand, and my parents told me more details about how my sister had treated them. Part of me felt genuinely sorry for them. Another part of me kept thinking, you picked your favorite, and this is where it got you. My father said they had nowhere else to go, that their cousin could only host them for a couple of nights, and that their savings were tied up because my sister had convinced them to put some of it into that doomed business. My mother kept looking around the apartment like she was cataloging everything, maybe comparing it to the life she imagined I should have, maybe wondering how this little space had become off-limits to her. I took a deep breath and told them I could not let them move in. My mother stared at me like I had slapped her. My father asked if I was really going to leave them out in the cold after everything. I said they were not out in the cold. They had money. They could get a motel room for a while. They could use whatever income they had left to find a small place to rent. My mother said their accounts were low and that they did not have access to certain funds because of the way things had been set up around the house. I said, and I will admit this was petty, that maybe they should ask my sister for help, since she was the one they had always believed would take care of them. My father flinched. My mother started crying again. She said I was being cruel. I said I was being honest. I reminded them that when they pressured me to give up my savings, it had not felt like love, it had felt like entitlement, and that I was not willing to recreate that dynamic here. I told them I hoped they got their house back, but I was not their backup plan. They left that night. I watched them walk down the hallway, dragging their bags, and I felt like the worst person alive, and also like I had finally done something right for myself. Both feelings sat in my chest side by side, refusing to move. After that, things went quiet for a while. I heard updates through a cousin who still talked to everyone and seemed to have turned into the unofficial family news station. My parents had hired a lawyer and started the process to get back into their own house. It turns out you cannot just change the locks and claim a property because you feel like it. It took months, though. There were hearings, paperwork, a lot of back and forth. I stayed out of it. Whenever my cousin tried to loop me in, I told her I did not want to be put in the middle again. Eventually, a judge granted some kind of order that allowed my parents back into the house. By the time they got inside, it barely looked like the place I had grown up in. My cousin described it to me over the phone, voice flat with disbelief. Walls painted random bright colors with streaks where the kids had apparently helped. A bathroom upstairs with a busted pipe that had leaked long enough to stain and crack the ceiling in the living room. Broken windows, trash bags half done, expensive electronics gone, jewelry gone, photo frames smashed. On top of that, some neighbor had called child services after seeing my niece and nephew running around outside half-dressed and hearing constant screaming. One of the kids had shown up to school with a broken arm that did not match the story my sister and her husband told. So on the heels of the property mess, there was an investigation into whether my niece and nephew were safe. Eventually, the kids were placed with my parents temporarily while the situation was sorted out. My cousin said my mother moved through the house in a daze, both happy to have her grandchildren and devastated by the condition of her home. My father went into fix-it mode, getting quotes for repairs he could not really afford and arguing with insurance about what was covered. One day, my phone rang with a number I did not recognize, but the area code suggested some kind of local office. Against my better judgment, I picked up. It was someone from child services. They said my name, explained they were trying to identify family members who might be able to take in my niece and nephew, asked about my living situation. I told them the truth. I lived in a small apartment with a roommate. I worked and studied. I could barely keep my own life afloat. And as much as I cared about those kids, I was not in a position to be anyone's primary caregiver. The woman on the phone was kind. She said she understood. She said they were just checking all options. When we hung up, I sat on the floor of my room and cried until my eyes hurt, because even after everything, I still felt like I had failed someone. My parents did not know about that call. What they did know was that raising 2 kids again at their age was exhausting and expensive. They had to pay for repairs, for legal fees, for food and clothes and school supplies, all while dealing with the emotional fallout of realizing their golden child had trashed their house and put their grandchildren in danger. You would think that would make them look in the mirror. Instead, they found a way to blame me. They started telling relatives that if I had just helped when they first asked, none of this would have spiraled like it did. According to the version that trickled back to me, my refusal had forced my sister into desperate decisions, which is wild considering she had already lost everyone's money before that conversation even happened. In their story, I was the selfish daughter who abandoned them, refused to open her door when they were homeless, and left them to raise two traumatized kids alone. The thing is, not everyone bought it. People had seen my sister's behavior for years. Neighbors had watched the police come by for noise complaints. Teachers had reported the kids coming to school unwashed. Extended family had heard enough inconsistent stories about the business to suspect things did not add up. So when my parents dropped little comments about how I turned my back on blood, a lot of people just nodded politely and then called me later to say they did not blame me. As for my sister and her husband, last I heard they were living out of their car, staying in different parking lots, occasionally crashing on friends' couches until those friends ran out of patience. Every time they tried to apply for an apartment, landlords called for references and found out about the property damage and the investigation with the kids. And the answer was always no. I know all this because my cousin overshares, and because my sister still posts vague, rage-filled messages on a social media app about betrayal and fake family. Sometimes I stalk those posts like an idiot, scrolling through the comments, seeing her friends tell her she is strong and misunderstood, that one day everyone will see the truth. I start to type something, then delete it, because there is no point. She is living in a story where she is the victim, and no paragraph from me is going to change that. Meanwhile, my life is not some magical happily ever after. I still work too much. I still freak out about money. My roommate and I fight sometimes about dishes or noise or who forgot to take the trash out. There are days when I miss having a house with a backyard and someone else cooking dinner. There are nights when I lie awake and wonder if I could have done anything differently, if there was some version of events where I kept my savings and my family. But there are also mornings when I wake up, make coffee in my little kitchen, open my laptop, and realize that no one is going to burst into my room asking me to watch their kids for just a minute. No one is going to dig through my drawers. No one is going to look at my bank account and see it as theirs. A few months ago, my supervisor at the testing job recommended me for a better position in another team. It pays a little more and gives me more hours. I grabbed it with both hands. I started taking on small freelance projects too, nothing huge, just fixing code or building simple websites for people who needed them. Slowly, my savings started to grow again, this time in an account my parents do not even know exists. I still see my parents sometimes. Holidays, mostly, when my cousin insists on hosting something neutral. We are polite. We ask each other about work and health and the kids. My niece and nephew have learned to run into my arms shouting my name again, which breaks my heart in this complicated way because I love them. And I also remember the little bed shoved into my room without anyone asking. My mother still throws out little comments about how hard it is to manage everything alone, about how nice it would be if someone with a good job in technology could help out more. My father still sighs heavily when money comes up, still looks at me like I am a bank he cannot access anymore. I answer in vague words and change the subject. I help in small ways sometimes, buying gifts for the kids or bringing extra food, but I do it because I choose to, not because someone guilted me into opening my wallet. People sometimes hear the short version of this story and say, I am strong for going no contact and then adjusting it to low contact, for setting boundaries, for choosing myself. I do not feel strong. I feel like a regular person who finally got tired of being treated like the emergency exit in a building that everyone else was allowed to burn down. If there is any lesson here, and I am not pretending to be wise enough to give one, it is that sometimes the only way to stop being the backup plan is to let people fall out of the safety net they built without you. It hurts. It looks ugly from the outside, and people will absolutely paint you as the villain in their version of events. But at some point you have to decide whether your whole life is going to be spent cleaning up the same messes for the same people. My name is Tessa. I am 22. I live in a small apartment in a not-so-fancy part of a mid-sized city in the United States. I pay my own rent. I study. I work in tech. I have a little savings account that I guard like a dragon. My family thinks I betrayed them. Maybe they will always think that. Maybe one day they will see things differently. Either way, I finally chose myself. And for the first time in a long time, when I look at my life plans, I can actually imagine them belonging to me. That does not mean everything suddenly makes sense now. I wish I could tell you that once I moved out and set boundaries, all the old guilt just packed its bags and left my brain. It did not. Some days it still feels like I am walking around with an invisible backpack full of family history that nobody else can see. I will be doing something totally normal, like debugging a piece of code or folding laundry, and my mind will toss in a memory of my mother crying at the kitchen table or my father saying, "You will regret this one day," like a pop-up ad I never agreed to. My roommate is the kind of person who grew up with parents that actually apologized when they were wrong, which I did not realize was a real thing outside of television families. One night we were sitting on the couch after a long day, sharing takeout noodles straight from the container, and she asked me what my parents were like when I was a kid. I thought about shrugging it off, but she had been there for the aftershock of the move and the midnight knock on the door, so it felt unfair to pretend everything started last year. I told her about the small things first. How my sister could skip chores and my mother would laugh and say she was tired, while if I forgot to take out the trash, my father would give me a whole lecture about responsibility and how the world would not go easy on me. How my sister could quit hobbies after 2 weeks and my parents would say she had a creative soul, while if I wanted to change anything, they accused me of not being committed. How, when we were teenagers, my sister got caught sneaking out and they blamed her friends. But when I asked for a later curfew for a school event, they acted like I was throwing away my future. My roommate listened, chewing slowly, her eyebrows scrunched together in this puzzled expression, like she was trying to solve a logic problem that did not quite add up. When I finished, she said, "So they trained you to perform for love and trained her to expect it for free." I laughed because it sounded dramatic, but the more I sat with it, the more it felt exactly right. No wonder my parents looked at my savings and saw a community resource. No wonder my sister looked at my boundaries and saw betrayal. A couple of months after I moved out, my cousin convinced me to go to a family event at her apartment. Nothing major, just a late afternoon gathering with food and kids running around. She promised my sister would not be there and that my parents had calmed down. I did not believe that last part. But I missed my cousin and I missed my niece and nephew, so I went. Walking into a room full of relatives when you know you are the current villain in the family group chat is a special kind of awkward. People get weirdly formal. They ask how you are in that voice that sounds like they are afraid of stepping on a landmine. A couple of cousins hugged me like nothing had happened. One aunt did the thing where she kissed my cheek and then whispered, "You should call your mother," in the same breath. My parents arrived late, which annoyed me because being on time is like my one neurotic point of pride. My father shook my hand like I was a neighbor he saw twice a year. My mother hugged me, but her body was stiff, like I was a coworker she did not really like. When she pulled back, she did that scanning thing with her eyes, taking in my clothes, my hair, my face, as if looking for visible signs of how I was living without them. The first half hour was tolerable. We talked about safe topics: work, school, the weather, the ridiculous rent prices. My niece climbed onto my lap like no time had passed at all and started telling me a very detailed story about a drawing she had made that involved a unicorn, a dinosaur, and a slice of pizza. My nephew asked if I still had my old game console and if he could come over to play sometime, and I had to swallow the lump in my throat before I said no, because inviting them into my space felt like opening a door my parents would eventually try to walk through. Eventually, of course, the conversation drifted to money. It always does with my parents. My father mentioned how expensive the house repairs had been, how the insurance had argued over every claim, how raising 2 kids again at their age was not easy. My mother talked about school supplies and shoes and how fast children grow out of clothes. None of that was shocking. Kids are expensive. Houses are expensive. Life is expensive. I nodded and said something neutral like, "That sounds really hard." Then my mother sighed and said, "Sometimes I wonder how different things would be if you had just stayed home and we had all worked together." She said it like she was talking about a missed bus or a burnt cake, not the fact that she had tried to demand my entire savings and then act surprised when I left. My father added, "We could have figured something out as a family," in that pointed way he has, like the word family is a knife he can twist. I felt every pair of eyes at that table shift between them and me, waiting. There is this version of me, the one I used to be, who would have swallowed the anger, changed the subject, made a joke. That version of me would have gone home later and replayed the conversation 100 times, coming up with better answers in the shower or while brushing my teeth. I could feel her ghost tugging at my sleeve, whispering that it was not worth the fight, that keeping the peace was safer. I did not listen to her. I put my fork down, took a breath, and said, "I did not leave because I hate you. I left because you made it clear that my money mattered more to you than my peace." The table went quiet in that thick way where even the kids kind of sense something is happening. My mother opened her mouth, probably to cry or accuse, but I kept going because I knew if I stopped, I would never start again. I told them, calmly and clearly, that asking me to hand over my entire savings after my sister had already lied about the business and lost everyone's money was not reasonable. I said that giving me an ultimatum and acting shocked when I chose myself was not fair. I said that showing up at my door in the middle of the night and expecting me to fix everything without even acknowledging the harm that had already been done was not loving. It was manipulative. My father's jaw clenched. My mother started crying, of course, but it sounded different this time. Less theatrical, more raw. A couple of relatives looked like they wanted to sink through the floor. My cousin was staring at me with big eyes, like she was watching a live performance of a speech she did not know I had in me. My mother said, "We were desperate," and I said, "I know, but desperation does not turn my savings into your property." My father said, "We did everything for you," and I said, "You did a lot for me, and I am grateful, but that does not mean I owe you my future every time things go wrong." My voice shook, but I did not back down. We did not resolve anything that night. They did not suddenly have a breakthrough and hug me and apologize. My parents are not movie characters, but something shifted in me. Saying those words out loud, in front of other people, made the story in my head feel a little less one-sided. For once, I was not just replaying their version. I was putting mine in the room. Later, when I was leaving, my father walked me to the door. He did not say much, just, "Drive safe," and a quiet, "You have always been stubborn." I almost laughed. I wanted to say, "You taught me that," but I let it sit. My mother hugged me again, softer this time. She still did not apologize, but she did not throw out any parting guilt grenades either. For my family, that counts as progress. Around the same time, I started seeing a therapist through a low-cost program my school recommended. I had always told myself therapy was for people with real problems, as if growing up in a house where love was measured in usefulness and financial sacrifice did not qualify. The first session, I spent most of the time giving her the bullet point version of everything. The favoritism, the business scam, the savings ultimatums, the midnight knock. She just nodded and occasionally asked, "And how did that make you feel?" in a way that did not sound like a meme, which was honestly impressive. At the end, she said, "It sounds like you were parentified very early and then blamed when you stopped playing that role." I had heard the word parentified before, but no one had ever handed it to me and gently stuck it on my forehead like a label that suddenly made all the puzzle pieces line up. No wonder I felt guilty saying no. I had been raised to believe that being valuable meant solving everyone else's crises, even if they were entirely self-inflicted. We worked on small things at first, answering my parents' messages slower instead of instantly, practicing saying, "I am not able to help with that," without adding a whole paragraph of justification. Not reading my sister's vague posts on that social media app like they were personal attacks carved into stone tablets. Celebrating tiny wins, like the day my mother called to complain about a bill, and I did not open my banking app out of pure reflex. In the middle of all this messy emotional work, life kept going in the background, like it does. At my job, the new testing position came with more responsibility and more visibility. I started sitting in on meetings where people actually listened when I pointed out an issue. I learned how to say, "Here's the problem, and here is what I think we should do," without immediately following it up with, "But I could be wrong." My supervisor, the same one who had once given me the talk about being late because of my chaotic home, pulled me aside one afternoon and said, "Whatever you are doing, keep doing it. You have really stepped up lately." I almost cried in the office bathroom after that, which would have been embarrassing, but also on brand for me. So whatever. I also finally dipped a toe into the thing I had been dreaming about since before everything exploded. My own little tech projects. Nothing huge. I'm not out here building the next world-changing app. But I made a simple website for a local tutor who needed a page for parents to contact her. Then I built a scheduling system for someone who walked dogs in the neighborhood. I charged small amounts at first, partly because I did not know what I was doing with pricing, and partly because a little voice in my head kept saying, "Who do you think you are asking people to pay you for this?" That voice is quieter now. Not gone, but quieter. One Saturday, I was at a hardware store with my roommate because the curtain rod in our living room had finally given up and crashed to the floor after one too many attempts to hang heavier fabric on it. We were in the aisle with the tools when I saw a familiar shape out of the corner of my eye. I turned my head and there she was, my sister. She looked different and exactly the same, tired in a way that went beyond just needing sleep. Her hair pulled back in a messy knot, clothes that did not quite fit right, dark circles under her eyes. She was standing next to one of those discount bins, looking at packs of batteries like she was doing complicated math in her head about what she could afford. For a second, my body moved before my brain. I took half a step in her direction, then stopped. She had not seen me yet. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like my ribs were trying to escape. A flood of memories hit me all at once. her laughing in the kitchen while my parents praised her, her shrugging off responsibility, her voice in the living room talking about my savings like they were a business opportunity, her silhouette behind the door while my parents pounded on it in the rain. My roommate followed my gaze and leaned in. "Is that her?" she whispered. I nodded. "Do you want to go say something?" she asked. I stood there, staring at the back of my sister's head, and realized that I did not. There was no speech that would fix everything. No sentence I could throw at her in the middle of a hardware store that would make her wake up and suddenly take responsibility for her choices. Anything I said would either start a fight in front of strangers or drag me back into a dynamic I had crawled and clawed my way out of. So I shook my head. "No," I said. "Not today." We walked away. My chest hurt, but there was also this small, surprising feeling of relief. Not revenge, not satisfaction at seeing her struggling. Just the quiet certainty that her life was not my problem to manage anymore. A few weeks later, my cousin sent me a photo from some family gathering I had skipped. It was my parents' living room, freshly painted, the ceiling repaired, new curtains hanging where the water damage had stained everything before. My niece and nephew were on the floor, coloring. My mother looked older, my father looked tired, but there was a softness in the way they sat near the kids. Under the picture, my cousin had just typed, "House looks like a house again." I stared at that photo for a long time. There was a universe where I had stayed, had bent myself into a shape that made everyone else more comfortable, had emptied my savings, had put my dreams on hold to patch up that house and that family. Maybe in that universe my parents would speak more gently about me at family events. Maybe in that universe my sister would dislike me a little less because I had been easier to use. But I do not live in that universe. I live in this one, where the house looks like a house again because my parents finally dealt with the mess their golden child made, and I finally stepped out of the role of unpaid repair crew. Sometimes I still feel alone in this choice. When I see friends posting about weekly dinners with their parents, or hear coworkers talk about how they go home for every holiday and genuinely enjoy it, there is a little sting. I have to remind myself that I am not broken for not having that. I am not defective because my version of family is complicated and loud and full of sharp edges. My therapist likes to say that you cannot heal in the same environment that made you sick. I rolled my eyes the first time she said it because it sounded like something you would see on a motivational poster with a sunset in the background. But the longer I live outside my parents' house, the more I get it. My room back there had been a shrine to survival, not growth. This tiny apartment with its crooked cabinet doors and dented fridge has seen more of who I actually am than that house ever did. So yes, my name is Tessa. I am still 22 for a little while longer. I still live in a small apartment in a not-so-fancy part of a mid-sized city in the United States. I still pay my own rent, I still study, I still work in tech, and I still have a savings account that I guard like a dragon. My family probably still tells whatever version of this story makes them feel better about themselves. The difference now is that I am finally telling my version too. And maybe that is the real rebellion here. Not moving out, not saying no, not even refusing to hand over the money. It is looking at the people who taught me to doubt my own perspective and saying, "No, this happened, and it mattered, and I get to say what it did to me." It is choosing to build a life where my value is not measured by how much I am willing to lose for other people. Maybe one day my parents will understand that. Maybe my sister will, though I am not holding my breath. Or maybe they will stay exactly who they are, and I will keep being the villain in their version of events. Either way, I am done living in a story I did not write. If that makes me stubborn, so be it. At least this time, I am stubborn on my own side. A little while ago, my professor asked everyone in class to write a short piece about where we saw ourselves in 5 years. Most people wrote about job titles, cities they wanted to move to, vague ideas of being successful or having it all figured out. When I opened a blank document, I just stared at the cursor for a long time. 5 years ago, if you had asked me that question, I would have given you some neat answer I thought my parents wanted to hear. Something about a respectable job, a respectable partner, maybe living close to home so I could help out. My dreams back then were always edited for their comfort, like I was handing them a draft and waiting for red pen corrections. This time, I wrote about wanting a small place with good light and shelves I built myself, even if they are a little crooked. I wrote about having clients who pay me because they trust my work, not because they are doing me a favor. I wrote about waking up on days off and deciding without guilt whether I call my family, see my friends, or just stay home in my pajamas watching something stupid while I eat cereal out of the box. I did not mention my parents in that piece. I did not mention my sister. For once, my future did not orbit around their reactions. When I read it out loud in class, my voice shook a little on the part about choosing rest without guilt. A couple of people nodded in that way that says, "Yeah, same." Afterward, a girl I barely knew came up to me and said, "I liked what you wrote. My mom thinks I am selfish for not wanting to move back home after graduation." It was nice to hear someone else say it out loud. We are not best friends now or anything, but it felt like a tiny piece of community in a world where family sometimes feels like a foreign language I do not speak well. There are still days when I slip. Days when my mother calls and I pick up on the first ring because my stomach drops and my brain goes straight to, what if something terrible happened and it is my fault somehow? Days when I hear that my niece had a school performance and I was not invited, and the old impulse flares up to drive across town and show up anyway, just to prove that I care. Days when I look at my bank balance and think about how much more money I could have saved if I had stayed, if I had just given in that one time. Then I remember that it was never going to be just one time. People who are used to you bleeding for them do not suddenly become satisfied after one last cut. They get used to the idea that you will always open the vein again if they ask in the right tone. Walking away did not magically fix them, but it did stop the bleeding on my side. That has to count for something. So yeah, I still second-guess myself. I still over-explain sometimes. I still draft long messages to my mother in my notes app, and then delete them because I know I am really just trying to win an argument she is not even in the room for. Healing, as it turns out, is not a straight line. It is more like bad code you keep refactoring. You fix one bug, and another one pops up in a different file. You keep going anyway because the program runs a little smoother each time. If you met me now at some random coffee shop and we started talking, you would probably not guess any of this from the outside. You would just see a woman in her early 20s with a laptop covered in generic stickers, sipping something too sweet, talking about deadlines and group projects and how the bus system makes no sense. You would not know that she once stood in a hallway listening to her parents talk about her savings like a winning lottery ticket. You would not know that she said no and watched her whole life tilt on its axis. But I would know, and that is enough for now.